From Sticks and Stones in Season 6 getting a ton of hate from fans, to Season 3's Creme de Monde, where Claire made some questionable choices, these are the most watched episodes of Outlander that fans hated. For starters, there's the Season 6 episode Sticks and Stones. As you'll soon see, this season isn't exactly a fan favorite, and a ton of fans felt like this specific episode summarized a lot of the problems Season 6 of Outlander had. One fan mentioned the story just left them scratching their heads. The major issue that they had was how Jamie's reputation seems to weirdly disappear because of some baseless accusations made by a character who isn't even that trustworthy.
Is it yours?
No, Uncle.
Then who? Who debauched her?
The fan felt like this sudden shift in perception didn't align with the well-established nature of the characters, and it felt forced and out of place. Honestly, if you add some sense to it all, someone like Malva would have been met with skepticism and ridicule rather than being taken seriously. The believability of the events that unfolded in this episode, and even the season overall, were questionable, to say the least.
I don't know why I struggle so much with the thought of all that sort of thing when we both know that
It's clear that Danielle Barrow, the writer for the episode, is relatively new to the field. Sure, having a PhD in Celtic history is impressive, but it doesn't necessarily translate to being a skilled television writer, especially without prior experience. The episode also suffers from a lack of direction and misguidance. It didn't help that after this episode, only one episode was left, which made fans have even less faith in Season 6 being somewhat salvageable.
And then he asked me if that would stop his granny turning him into a ghost too.
I told him that.
But that's not the only episode of Outlander that fans hated, because there's also Season 5's famous last words. Now, I've got to mention fans are a bit split when it comes to this one. Some folks found it super interesting and even went as far as to call it cinematic, but others rank it as one of their most hated episodes, and they've got a pretty good reason for it. If you're caught up till Season 5, you'll know that this episode dives into flashbacks of the struggles Roger went through in the Battle of Alamance. People aren't the biggest fans of flashbacks, but for some reason they decided to show these flashbacks as some rota old-timey silent film that had an ugly sepia filter covering the whole screen. I mean, just one scene with this ugly color palette would have been tough to watch, but there were multiple flashbacks in this episode. Needless to say, it got super tiring and repetitive, and fans felt like it ruined an otherwise interesting storyline, especially because the book handled this part of the Outlander story so well, but the show, trying to be way too artsy, completely ruined it. A lot of the folks who defend the show do so because they've read the books, and so they know just how much potential the episode had. But here's the thing, you can't really judge something because of how good it could have been potentially. Truth is, the way that it's actually presented in the series is way too over the top and grating to be watchable. Though it's not just the newer episodes that fans hated, because even Season 1's The Search episode pops up on the most hated lists. Now, this is another case of book readers not liking the way the material was handled in the show. It's possible that if you've only seen the TV series, then you may not even dislike this episode, but for book readers, it's one of the worst. Just why is that? Well, that's because a lot of what happened in The Search felt like it was written by the writers and wasn't a part of the original storyline. This resulted in the plot being badly written, far too long, and just generally a lot worse than its counterpart in the books. Plus, because it's not even related to the storyline of the books, you can pretty much skip this episode and not even miss a whole lot of details. So even if you go through the trouble of watching this episode, there's almost no point to it. Back when it came out, a fan mentioned it was their least favorite episode up until that point, especially because of that song and dance routine. The entire concept of it felt a bit out of character and way too silly even for Outlander. Another fan mentioned on IMDb that they were watching it with a couple of friends and felt super embarrassed when that cringy dancing sequence popped up. Now, if it was something small, then maybe they could have gotten away with it. But the singing and dancing take up way too much time, and in the end, there just isn't any real enjoyment that fans got out of it. Speaking of getting no enjoyment, here's another episode from Season 6. Yeah, I'm talking about the second of the season, Allegiance. Now, while some episodes have a somewhat interesting concept, that doesn't translate well on screen. And others take a risk by straying from the books. To try something new, this one does what's probably the biggest sin in television. It's just straight up boring. I'm serious. The biggest complaint about Allegiance is that it's just kind of a slog to sit through, though that's pretty par for the course when it comes to Season 6. A fan mentioned that they were only 23 minutes into the episode, and they were already looking to see how much of it was left. They also mentioned that the show is almost too obsessed with kids and babies, with way too many pregnancy plot lines being thrown into the mix. It's fine once or twice, but when you keep repeating the same stories, it starts to get a bit repetitive and uninteresting. Another user even went as far as to say that they felt like the show's original writers had been held hostage somewhere because it's impossible to believe that these are the same people who wrote the show's earlier seasons. A fan also pointed the blame toward the episode's director, in saying that, writing aside, the editing also just felt a little choppy, with unnecessary filler scenes being added between cuts, and even though a lot of the dialogue was taken straight from the books, fans didn't find it nearly as engaging or interesting in the adaptation. And the same can be said about this next episode. I'm talking about episode 7 from season 4, Down the Rabbit Hole. The main gist of this episode is that it follows Brianna as she tries to follow in her mother's footsteps, traveling through the stones back in time to 18th century Scotland. And while that may sound interesting to you, as a fan of the character, for a lot of people who weren't, this almost felt like a filler episode. I mean, no one likes to sit through an entire episode focused on a character they don't even like. To make matters worse, some fans even called out the actress, saying that her portrayal is what makes the character, and by extension, the episode, so uninteresting for them. And as you've probably noticed from some of the other episodes on this list, one of the biggest complaints regarding Down the Rabbit Hole was the fact that it just strayed too far from the source material. People who read the books felt like a lot of the screen time was wasted, with needless changes being introduced that take away from the originality of the books. Plus, Book 4 tends to be one of the most favorite books for a lot of fans of Outlander. So the fact that the writers changed so many of the details from it rubbed fans the wrong way. No, the episode wasn't a complete disaster. In fact, some folks even enjoyed this new take on the storyline. But in general, it's fair to say the episode has gotten more hate than praise from fans. And there's one other episode that deserves to be on this list. And that's Creme de Mento from season 3. This episode got a lot of flack for the way that Claire was written in it. People found it weird that she was trying so hard to save a man who outright assaulted her. A fan even mentioned that she felt like acted like a prized idiot for trying to save that thug. One fan even mentioned that this part of season 3 is where the series started to go downhill. The previous episode wasn't exactly a home run, and to make matters worse, this one came along with a bunch of issues. Not only was it boring and did nothing to move the story along, but the choices made by the characters, especially Claire, felt totally weird and absurd. Though there are folks who defend the episode, saying that there are elements of it that are done well, especially stuff like costume design and acting. I feel like if all of it is in service to a story that just isn't clicking with the fans, then what's the point? So from season 3's Creme de Mento, where Claire made some questionable choices, to Sticks and Stones in season 6 getting a ton of hate from fans, those were the most watched episodes of Outlander that fans hated.